Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn how to create GUIs in Godot. Before that, just a couple of quick notes. So I've increased the font of everything, the font of the slides, the font of Godot, basically as many things that you'll see. If I could increase the font, I did. The reason why I did that is because some of you via comments have told me that you watch these videos on your phone. So hopefully the bigger font will help you with that. Now, I want to note that you need to watch the videos in this series, the Godot series, in order because they build on one another. In particular, for this video, the GUI video, you need to have watched my signals and slots video. Or if you didn't watch my video, that's fine, but you need to have an understanding of signal slots. So you should have watched another video or read the documentation. You need to know how signals and slots work, okay? I'll review it a bit. More so, I will actually be showing you everything that I do. So when I create a scene, I'll show you. When I add a node to a scene, I'll show you. I still want to show you because I think this is like the 6th video or something like that. So you're still kind of early in this course. So I still want to kind of keep showing you the things so that the repetition will help you remember it. But eventually, okay, I'm going to stop doing that. So when I say create a scene, I'm not going to show you because you're going to know how to do that. So the basics, for now, I'm still going to show you, but maybe in the next video or in a few videos, I'm going to stop doing that, just for the sake of time, all right? But for now, I'll still show you everything. So what we're going to do for this video is we're going to switch between slides and coding. I like this approach. It's more organized. Slides kind of give you an overview, prepares you, and then coding shows you, and especially when we run it, you know, and you see the results, it really helps tie everything together. So that's what we'll do. And if you don't understand the slide, you know, don't give up. Wait until the code or in the result of the code. Sometimes the slide is easier to explain things, and sometimes the code in the actual result speaks louder. So that's why I do both, okay? If you don't get one of them, it's likely that the other will help you. Okay, so quickly let's go over some topics we'll cover. All right, so controls are basically the GUI elements that you can combine to build your own GUIs in Godot. If you're familiar with other GUI frameworks, sometimes these things are called widgets. Godot calls them controls, okay? So we'll go over some basic controls, the commonly used ones, just a couple of them. And then we'll go over containers. Now, containers are also controls, but they're a special type of control. Their only purpose is to hold other controls inside them. And then we'll cover 2 patterns, common patterns for using and creating GUIs. And along the way, we're going to play with some code. And at the very end, we're going to summarize what we learned. All right, so some example of controls is buttons, sliders, labels, etc. A common note, so all GUI classes in Godot, they are controls. So they inherit from a base class called control, okay? Even containers. So that means that they have some commonly used properties, methods, and signals. And again, quick reminder, signals are emitted when the control is interacted with, usually by the user. So first control we're going to take a look at is button. And for each one of these controls, I list commonly used properties, methods, and signals. So here I'm telling you that the button has a text property that's commonly used, and that basically determines what text is shown on the button. It also has a signal called pressed that has no arguments, but the press signal is emitted when the button is clicked. Quick reminder, signals, right, they're emitted when special things happen to a node. Sometimes signals have arguments which give you additional information, details about what has happened. Some signals have no arguments. It's because you don't need any additional details. Here, what else do you need to know? It was pressed. All right, so at this point, I want to go ahead, launch Godot, and show you. Just put a button in. So start up Godot. Well, first of all, on your desktop, go ahead and create a new folder. So you won't be able to see this, but I know you know how to do that. Just create a new folder anywhere. I'm going to call mine GUI test. All right. Now click new project and browse to your new folder. So mine was on desktop, GUI test, and I'm going to name my project GUI test, create and edit. We're going to use OpenGL ES3. It's newer. Okay, so now in your scene, go ahead, click 2D because we want a 2D scene. And then as the root node, we're going to go ahead, add a new node, and we're just going to make the root node control. So that's the most generic GUI element in Godot. So we're going to create a control as our root. The reason why I did that is because I'm going to put a bunch of controls as a child so that I can show you all of them, okay? So let me add a child, and we're going to add a button. So just search button here, create. All right, so I said that button had one really important property, and again, the inspector on the right-hand side shows you all the properties of the selected node, right? So here, all the nodes, and I want to go over this real quick again. So remember that the scene tab shows you the hierarchy of the nodes that you have in your scene. Basically, it shows you the same thing that's here, but in like a hierarchy format, right? So what's shown here and what's shown here is really the same thing, but here you're visualizing them, and here they're shown in a hierarchy. Now, whether you select something in here in the scene or you select it in the hierarchy, either case you have some node or nodes selected, right? When you select them, the inspector shows you all their properties and you can change them. All right, so that was a little review. Now for the button, I said that it has a text property, and that's right at the top. And another thing, the properties are kind of nicely organized in classes. So button, here's all of its specific properties that are specific to the button class, but button inherits from base button, and here are the properties that inherits from base button. Button also inherits from control, and here are the properties grouped, the properties for control. So you see how the properties are kind of organized by class, right? So here's the most derived class, here's a super class, and here's a super class. And they're also kind of categorized by groups sometimes too. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, now really back on track. So when we select the button, we see that the button, most derived class here, right, has a text property, and that's basically just what text you want the button to display. Right now it has no text. So you can see that there's nothing there, right? But if I select it and I make the text, so let's say we'll make it Abdullah, and there you go. All right, and I won't show you the signal. So to connect to a signal of the button, you just do something like button.connect, and then you pass the name of the signal, etc. I'm going to be lazy here, and I'm just going to tell you go watch my signals and slots videos, or look up signals in the Godot documentation, okay? All right. Now, label next, and label's simple. It just displays a little bit of text. You can't click on it, you can't interact with it, nothing. It's just for displaying some text. So let's go ahead and create that. All right, select your control, and then you can either right-click and choose Add Child Node, or you can use the shortcut Control A. So that's what I usually do. I just select the node that I want to create a child for, and then press Control A. So here we want to search for label, and notice all like labels and buttons, all controls that I use, you'll notice that they're under the control base class. That's because they inherit from control. So this viewer over here, it shows the nodes the way that the class hierarchies are. So this is saying that label inherits from control, which inherits from canvas item, which inherits from node. That's kind of useful to know as well, all right? So anyways, let's go ahead and add this label. So here we have our label, and you'll notice it's also over there. We'll change that later, but here's its text property, right? What text do you want the label to show? So because I'm not super creative right now, we're going to make it say Abdullah's label, right? And let's go ahead and just kind of move this down. So we'll select it and move it down here so you can see. So that's all a label is. Now, often you use a label like in front of other things, like if there was a form input, what Godot calls a line edit, right? You would do something like here, you would put in the label, you put name, and then right next to it you have an area where the user can type their name. So that's typically what you use labels for. Okay, so texture button. Texture buttons are basically fancy looking buttons. You still click them, but they display images instead of just that little plain button graphics. So they have really 4 important properties, and I should note that they also have that signal, this press signal. Okay, they still have that. I should have put that here. Maybe I'll add that after. Okay, well, in addition to that signal, they have 4 properties. These are their names, so texture normal, texture hover, etc. And these just specify what picture the button shows in its different states, right? So the normal is when the button's just kind of hanging out, it's normal. The hover is when you move your mouse over the button. What picture do you want it to show when the mouse is over it? The pressed is what picture do you want the button to show when you hold the mouse button down. So when you press the mouse button, basically you're pressing the button down, right? And disabled is what if the button is disabled. Buttons have a disabled property. When you turn that on, they can't be interacted with. So when the button is disabled, you may want it to look different. Often, most GUI frameworks show disabled controls as kind of like grayed out. You may have seen that. All right, let's go ahead and create a button. So again, select your node that you want to add a child to, Control A to add a child, and we're going to search for texture button. All right, and I'm going to move it right here. So there it is in our hierarchy here, and you don't see anything yet, but you'll notice that the texture button has a group of properties called textures, right? Here's the normal, pressed, hover, disabled. And I'll show you how to set these textures nice and easy. First of all, you need some images. I have some images, so I'm going to open up my project folder here. I'm going to create a new subfolder. I'm just going to call it images, and I'm going to move all my images in there. So I have 4 of them. You'll notice as soon as I do that, in the file system tab, we get our images folder, and I see the images here. So for the normal, I want to use my normal image. You can just click and drag. That's kind of nice. So there the normal picture shows. All right. Now when the button is pressed, I want it to show this picture here. When the mouse hovers over the button, I want it to show this other picture here. And when the button is disabled, I want it to show this picture here. So first of all, what you see here is normal, okay? When the button is normal. And the reason why you don't see it change when I hover over it now is because we're not running this scene, right? We're not running this game. This is an editor. So let me show you real quickly. We're going to go ahead and try to run this scene, and if you haven't saved it, it'll ask you to save it first. So we're going to go ahead and save it. I'm just going to leave it at the root, and I'm going to call it GUI test. All right, let's see it. So there's normal. I move my mouse over it. Now you see the hover image, and then when I press the mouse, you see the pressed image. When I release, you see the hovered, and when I move away, you see the normal. So there you go. And last, let me show you what the disabled looks. So if I select it in the editor and I turn on the disabled property, which is inherited from the base button class, there's the disabled image. So I kind of grayed it out. Okay, on to the next. So the line edit allows 1 line of text input. For the user, it's basically somewhere where the user can type in 1 line and give that to you, okay? So here are some important properties, methods, and signals. So we have the text property again, and this is basically what text is in the text input. Self-explanatory. The clear method will clear all the text in the line edit. 2 signals here. We have the text change and the text entered. The text change signal is emitted whenever any character in the line edit changes. And the text entered signal is only changed when you basically press enter, right? So you type something and then you press enter. So the text change signal is changed much more frequently because as you are adding characters, this signal is constantly getting emitted for every character that you add or delete. but the text entered is only emitted once you press enter. And they both have one argument, which basically tells you what the new text that it was changed to or that it was entered. So let's go ahead and create that. All right, select our root, Control A to add a new child node. We're gonna search for line edit and we're gonna add it. And here's its text property. Well, I'm not gonna put anything there right now, but let me go ahead and, so right now I'm moving the line edit, and let me move the label next to it. So this is kind of how you use it usually. You put a label and then a line edit where the user can enter some text. Let me run this so I can show you. So you see, I can click it and I can type stuff in. My name is Asada. All right, on to the next. Slider, you have a horizontal and a vertical one. And I'm sure you've seen these. These are just little things that you can slide, and they're for selecting a bounded numerical value. Here are some important stuff about it. It has a min value property and a max value property. Those are self-explanatory. What's the minimum number that you want selectable with this slider, and what's the maximum number? Step is how much the number increments by, right? So if I make the step 2, then you would go, from like your minimum to minimum plus 2 and then minimum plus 4. So, so if your minimum is 0, you'd go from 0 to 2 to 4 to 6. You get the idea. The tick count is in the graphics of the slider. How many little tick marks do you want displayed? The value change signal is emitted whenever the user changes the value in the slider. So as they're dragging the slider around, you're going to be emitting the value changed signal. And that has one argument, and that argument tells you the new value. So let me show you that. Okay, select your root, Control A. We're going to add we'll do a horizontal one. Vertical one is very similar. It's just the vertical instead of horizontal. So H slider is horizontal, V slider is vertical. All right, so let's move that slider somewhere here. All right. Now, so min value, we'll say this will be, 1 to 5. All right. We'll want 1 to 5. So that's 5 different values. Step, we want 1. We want it to increment by 1. And then tick count. How many ticks? Well, I want 1 tick for every value possible. Since we have 5 possible values, I'm going to choose 5 ticks. And so you don't see anything right now. It's because the size of the slider is too small. But if I drag this and make it bigger, there, now you can see it. And you'll see that we have, we have 3. Even though I specified 5 ticks, it only shows 3. That's kind of weird. And it does this by default. It doesn't show the ticks on the border. In order to show the ticks that are on the border, you have to check this Boolean property. And there you go. So now that's 5 tick marks. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let me show you just sliding the slider around. So as you're sliding it, that value changed signal is emitted, okay? Okay, now we're going to go and talk about containers. So containers, basically, in Godot, all the controls that inherit from the container class are called containers, all right? Container controls determine the size and position of their children. So the children no longer control their own size and positioning, and you can't actually manually set the children's size and positioning anymore. You can only give what are called hints, right? So there are certain hints in the child that you can set, but the absolute control as to the positioning and the size of those controls are up to the container that the controls are in, all right? So first we're going to talk about a panel container. I use this one a lot. It's a container that displays an opaque, so a solid background, whether that's a solid color or an image. And this is very important, and it expands all of its children to cover its whole area. Now, I normally only add a single child to the panel, right? So I have a panel and then I have one child. And so it will expand that child to cover the entire area of the panel. So as I resize the panel, its child is resized to cover the whole area. All right, now the next container is HBox container. So it's a container that arranges its children horizontally. So as you add children, they keep getting stacked left to right. A VBox container, it arranges its children vertically. So as you add children, they get stacked basically top to bottom, I believe. All right, so here's the first useful pattern. Oftentimes, here's what my scene hierarchy looks like, okay? So at the root, I'll have a panel container, and then I'm gonna have a single VBox container as a child of that panel container. So as you resize the panel container, the VBox container gets expanded to fill its entire thing. Now in the VBox container, I put a bunch of HBox container, and then I put two things inside each HBox container. Usually the first thing I put a label, and for the second thing I put some sort of an input control like line edit, slider, etc. So let me show you this real quick. All right. Now, what I want to do is create a new scene. So we're going to do scene, new scene. And as the root, I'm going to go ahead and choose panel container. And Control A to add a child. We're going to add VBox container. So there it is. Now as its child, we're going to add HBox container. Inside the HBox container, I'm going to have two things. First, a label usually, and then second, I'm going to add some kind of an input, like line edit. So you'll see the use case here, right? So for the label, let me set the text something like first name. So you're starting to see the use, right? So let me add another HBox container in the VBox container. So select the VBox container, Control A to add a child, HBox container. All right, and we're gonna add a label again. And let's say a slider, we won't get too fancy, a horizontal slider. So what your first name is, and then this label, we're gonna make it say number of cars. So how many cars you own. And I know this example is really stupid, but you get the point. So for the horizontal slider, let's make it 1 to like 5. You're not going to own more than 5. Well, 0, some people don't have a car. And then increments is 1. You can't have half a car. And we want to show ticks. So I'm going to do 6 ticks because 0 to 5 is 6 values. And I want the ticks on the border. I don't know why by default that's off. All right. So again, you'll notice that we have that sizing issue. So, well, before I talk about that, notice, what happened here, right? So let me show you actually via slides. This is one of those things that's easier with slides, all right? So for now, ignore what I have on the bottom. All right, so what I did was I added a VBox container, right, as the root. And then inside the VBox container, I added 2 HBox containers, right? And then inside each, so for example, inside this HBox container, I added a label, and then I added a line edit, right? And then, let's go back. I don't want to show you that yet. So yeah, this is what I did. Now, you notice that you still, if my VBox container was this big, right? You notice that there's still a little bit of space here in the HBox container. And this little bit of space is just empty, right? So this is what it would look like if I resize it. Let me show you that. I'm having a little bit of trouble explaining this, but let me select my panel container, resize it to make it bigger. There, now you see it, right? So this box is my VBox container. You'll see if I select it. Here's another little tip. If you select things in your, whether in your scene viewer or your hierarchy here, you'll see their bounding box. So that's a nice way to see how much space things are taking. It's very useful when you're working with GUIs. So anyways, I select my VBox container. You notice this is its bounding box, right? Let's select the HBox container. You'll notice that's its bounding box. So that's where I got my slide picture. So notice that we have the HBox container has all this empty space, right? That's because And it does nothing with that empty space. But these controls, so all controls, including label, including line edit, all controls, they have an expand Boolean property. And if you set that to true, what that tells to the parent container is, hey, if you have extra space, I would like all or some of that space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, okay? So here's what it would look like if I put both of these guys as expand to true. Now, what that's telling to the parent is the label saying, hey parent, if you have extra space, give some to me. The line edit says, if you have extra space, give some to me. So how does it divide it? How does the parent divide its extra space amongst all of the children that have requested it? It looks at their stretch ratio, what's called a stretch ratio. So in addition to having an expand property, all these controls also have a stretch ratio property. And that controls how much extra space they get. So here's a visual example. Here, what I've done is I set both of these guys as expand flag on, and then I gave the label a stretch ratio of 1 and the line edit a stretch ratio of 2. Now what that's saying is that twice as much extra space goes to the line edit than the label. That it's important to note that it's twice as much extra space, not twice as much space absolutely, okay? So this extra space, twice as much of it will go to the line edit as that will go to the label. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now that I showed you that, let me show you it actually working. So if we select this guy, so we want all this extra space to really go to this guy, right? So I'm going to select him, and I'm going to go all the way down to the control section of the properties, and I'm going to expand size flags, and then I'm going to choose expand. Now one quick little, I guess, caveat here is that this expand, everything that I said about expanding and stretch ratio has a horizontal component and a vertical component. So they say, you know, do I want to expand horizontally and do I want to expand vertically? So what I'm saying here for this line edit, I'm saying if there's any extra space in the horizontal direction in the parent container, you know, give some to me. And all the space goes to this guy because this guy, right, he doesn't have his expand flag on. Now if I turn on this guy's expand flag, let's see what happens. Now you notice that half of the space goes to him and half the space goes to him. What if I want twice as much space to go to the line edit? So I just remember that this guy's stretch ratio is 1, which is the default. And then this guy's stretch ratio, I just make it a 2, which means give me twice as much free space. All right, but usually, you know, I don't want to expand the label, so I'm going to turn that off. And I'm going to leave that. And then I also want this slider, so I'm going to select this slider, and I'm going to make sure that it expands horizontally. And there we go. That looks a lot better. Now you see, as I resize this panel container, those will always get the extra space. I want to quickly mention fill here. So you'll notice in addition to the expand flag, they have a fill flag. So what the fill, so both of these flags, the expand, fill, and also the stretch ratio property, all three of these properties are basically a hint to the container that these controls are in as to how they should be sized, right? Now the fill flag tells the parent container that, well, basically the fill flag says that any space that the parent allocates to me, so any space that the parent has given to me, I'm going to expand to use it, okay? And the expand flag is about free space, so not space that has already been allocated to you, but any free space that's in your parent container. Expand basically says you are requesting the parent to give you some of that free space. They're slightly different. If you play around with these, you'll kind of get them. Fill is by default on, but expand isn't. All right, so this is kind of what we already covered. So these are some important properties for controls that are in containers, right? These kind of hint the container how to allocate space, essentially. Phil says that the control should make itself big enough to take up all the space that the container has given it, right? All the space that has been already allocated to it. Expand says if my parent container has any extra space, I would like some of that extra space. And stretch ratio determines how that extra space is distributed. Another useful container is the grid container. It arranges children in a grid, kind of self-explanatory, but I'll show you anyways. This is the only important property for it, really. It's columns, how many columns you want in the grid. You'll get as many rows as, as you keep adding controls to the grid container, new rows will be created as needed. So when you add things, they go left to right, top to bottom. And let me show you that, and then it'll make sense once I show you. This is one of those things that are easier to show you in the editor. That's why, again, I use slides and the editor, because, different topics are easier to show in different ways. So let's go ahead and create a new scene. Scene new, and as the root, I'm going to add panel container again. I'm trying to think. Maybe I want to show you the slide first, okay? So here's a pattern that involves using a grid container. So let me go over this first, and then I'll show you this pattern and thus the grid container. So I usually have a panel container and then a grid container, and I add my labels and input controls like so. All right, so now let me show you this. So as the root, go ahead and add a panel container. As a child, we're going to go ahead and add. Grid container. Yes, grid container. And then we're going to set the number of columns to 2. And now watch what happens as I add controls inside the grid container. So let me add a label. This is going to go in the left. So in the left column, it'll be row 1. Let's go ahead and set the text of the label to, I guess, name again. We'll do first name. All right, and now in the grid container, I'll add a second child. We'll do a line edit. You notice, see, so first item goes left, second item goes in the next column, and now that you've run out of columns, the next item will go in the second row. So that's why I said left to right, top to bottom, okay? So watch what happens now. For the third item, I'll add a label again. Let me make the text last name. And let me add, watch, so it went there. Now fourth item, I'm going to add a line edit. And it went there. So there you go. Now let's see what happens if I select this panel container and I resize it. Remember, the panel container, as it's getting resized, it forces its child to occupy its entire bounding box. So we can verify that in the editor. When I select the panel container, you see its bounding box, right? Now when I select the grid container, you see that its bounding box is the same. So as I expand or shrink the panel container, its child gets expanded and shrunken. That's kind of the use of the panel container. All right, and once again, if we want these guys, so we can see what's going on here, right? Here's our panel containers bounding box, and here's our grid containers bounding box. And let's go, here's our labels bounding box, and here's our line edits bounding box. So let's select our line edit. Let's go to size flags. Let's make sure that it takes up any free space in the horizontal direction. And there you go. So the cool thing that I've noticed, and I didn't really know this until I started playing with grid containers, you notice that I just set expand for just like one item in this column. And it kind of automatically almost set expand. It automatically expands all other things in that same column, which is kind of cool. So anyways, now as I resize the panel container, you'll see those guys will expand. All right, so we went over some commonly used controls, in particular buttons, labels, texture buttons, and sliders. And we also went over some of their commonly used properties, methods, and signals. And you have this slide as a reference if you need it. We also covered containers, right? Containers control children's size and position. But the size flags of the children, so fill, expand, stretch ratio, kind of hints to the container how it should be sized in a way. We covered two useful patterns. So here's the first, here's the second. The first was basically a panel container with a VBox container inside of it and then a bunch of HBox containers. And all the HBox containers had a bunch of controls, usually a label and some type of an input control. And our second pattern had a panel container, a grid container with two columns, and then all the controls in there. So that's it for this video. I'm going to put a link to these slides in the description of the video in case you guys want to keep it as a review or as a summary or as a reference. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.